Are we ready to dive into our movie of the week?
I think so.
Okie doke. Alrighty. So, Caleb, what are we talking about this week?
We are talking about the beloved holiday classic, It's a Wonderful Life.
My lips bleeding, Bert. All right. So, how do you like this movie? Do you enjoy this movie?
So this is a tough one for me. Um, it was years before I finally watched this movie,
Uh-huh.
and I enjoyed it. And then I think because of just Christmas traditions that my wife and I have, I think I kind of got over it a little bit.
Oh, well,
I haven't.
that's just
Yeah,
blasphemy. Are you
I know.
crazy?
I know it is, right?
You can't get
Um,
sick of this movie.
it hasn't made its way back into our yearly repeat for a couple years, so
Yeah, I
it's
mean,
probably due. But
I
we're
have yet
pretty
to watch it this
consistent.
year, so I probably should
Okay,
soon.
we're pretty consistent in like watching the same Christmas movies every year. Um, so it's probably time to put it back in the rotation.
Maybe we should talk about. Oh, okay. So this one. Well, I can't say I've watched it every year, but I've watched it plenty of times, plenty of Christmases.
Hmm.
Um, so uh, the getting over it aside, like, what was your first feeling about the movie when you first watched it? Did you enjoy it?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
So the first time I watched it, I did enjoy it. It just took me years to get to. I
Hmm.
do recall I want to say my dad watching it a couple times as a kid, seeing him watch it, but never sitting down and watching it with him.
Hmm.
Um, maybe it was just on in the background or something. And yeah, but I enjoyed it. I think the first time I saw it in its original black and white, all that good stuff.
I think I'm trying to think if I've ever seen it colorized. Maybe once. I don't
Yeah,
know.
the colorized version of it, it's pretty hokey. The colorization that they did.
Yeah.
So the black and white is actually better, I think. But
Yeah. Yeah. You gotta
um,
usually go with the original. Come on.
yeah.
Yeah.
I enjoy it. I think it there was a lot of tension in that film.
Hmm.
Like it has a good range of emotions, which I
Hmm.
think is good. But I think that also might have been one of the reasons why I kind of needed a break was because of the like every time I watched it, it would like I get so anxious, like waiting for the end, and
Yeah. Every time what's his name? Uncle Billy or whatever.
yeah,
He
yeah,
he loses the money in the newspaper. It's like, if only. Anyways, yeah, we always feel that emotion in the movie that it gets like so stressful towards the end every time you watch it. But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So what okay. So we're probably going to talk about, the spiritual themes here, but it is kind of funny. Like, we've talked so much about politics to a certain extent, um, particularly certain themes. Um, Strangely enough, they might come up again a little bit here in a bit, and they're kind of connected to the spiritual themes. Um, but how would you relate this movie to Christianity? It's not hard. I mean, there's an overt spiritual element throughout the movie.
Yeah.
How sound is it? I mean, it's kind of supposed to be a little whimsical, but how, the whimsicalness aside, like the themes that
Yeah.
it touches on, like, you can think whatever about the angels and
Yeah, yeah.
Clarence and all that, and I mean, whatever. I don't make much of it, but
Right.
um, I mean, who knows? Maybe it works that way a little bit. It's not
Never
necessarily.
know.
I don't know. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think as far as just like some basic themes, I think good triumphing over evil in the end, although um, I never really considered the fact that Potter doesn't really ever, you never see a resolution with him.
Hmm.
But, good ultimately triumph over evil. You see, really the community they're rallying around
Hmm.
George, all that good stuff. Um, George is a guy that makes a lot of sacrifices for others. Um, loves his community, loves his family. Um, Obviously, he goes through a really dark time here in the movie, um, and he struggles to do the right thing. But in the end, he does the right thing.
Yeah,
And
and I think it's kind of poetic Potter not getting his comeuppance per se. He does by nature of who he is.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
that, you know, um, even though everything could be pinned on George Bailey for his screw up, as it were. Like everything he did through his life had resolution. In that
yeah.
he his friends that he took care of for his whole life wouldn't just let him go like that. They wouldn't just
Right.
believe something like that about him because of the way he lived his whole life.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, Potter kind of got a win in the end, but the way he lived
Mm.
his whole life, it was no help to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's sort of, I guess, the point in a sense.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to get beat up. His very existence came to a point where it was its own punishment. You know, it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting. However, back when this movie came out, there was there were some political turmoil going on in that era,
Mhm.
and it led to some questions about this movie. And I think honestly, I think they're worthwhile questions, even though some people might find this kind of silly. It does kind of cause me to ask, you know, what should we think about this? So I'm going
Yeah.
to bring up a Snopes article, actually. And by judging by the title of the article, it'll sort of spark the topic a little bit. So let's take a look here. Let me jump over here, and this should just work if I go like this. All right. Did the FBI once deem It's a Wonderful Life communist propaganda? Why would they do this? What, do you remember the history surrounding this? Maybe you can give us a little summary.
Yeah. So this would have been the age of McCarthyism and the Red Scare and Hollywood.
What was that for the total noobs?
Yeah. So would have this? What year was? I
This
guess
was in
more
the
than a year.
40s, wasn't it?
The 40s. Yeah. So McCarthy was a
Maybe after. I don't know.
was he a senator or congressman?
I feel like
He was in politics.
senator. I think senator. I don't,
Yeah.
Make me feel
So
ignorant when you ask me the difference between the two. But
so I remember listening to a podcast about him recently, and he kind of got his start into this hoping to make a name for himself. So he was okay with being a little bit crazy because he was trying to be, you know, he was trying to climb the political ladder, you know, and this was going to get his name out there. So he would threaten
you might throw in
people.
some details here that I don't know about. So
Yeah,
continue,
maybe,
please.
never know. He would threaten people with, you know, legal action if he, you know, that they were on some list that he had secretly from the FBI of all known communists in the country. And so he really caused a scare in the nation because people started to go like, you know, is my neighbor a communist? You know, all
My
this kind of stuff.
dad said senator, but he's going to check.
Okay.
I think the term Senator McCarthy sounds right.
It does, but
Yeah.
you never know.
Yeah. Anyways, continue.
And so, you know, people were really fearful of being brought under charges from him. And there was a lot of people in Hollywood who were getting put on this supposed list. And the interesting thing is, I don't really know if there actually ever was a list. I think that's been debated or not. You know, if I remember that part correctly, I may be wrong again, but it kind of was just at his whim, you know, whether somebody was actually on the list or not. But in the course of it, he probably did expose a good number of actual communists because people started to kind of rat others out. And I think that's really what started taking place in Hollywood. You had informants that were basically ratting others out. Perhaps an odd mark in history is when Walt Disney kind of was one of those who was not on the side of being accused of being a communist. He kind of was on the opposite side of being one of those guys who would out certain communists and whatnot. So that's an interesting earmark in history.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it really wasn't surprising when you sent the article over that this would have fit that era,
Right.
writers, producers, directors were kind of, and of course actors and actresses, were being accused of communist propaganda.
Yeah, yeah. And so here's the thing. McCarthy, from all I can tell, I mean, everyone seems unified the fact that he was pretty over the top,
Yeah.
and it was a pretty tyrannical period in a lot of ways because of this. That said, it wasn't a fake scare because just because he
Right.
was over the top doesn't mean there was no communist influence. There were overt, self-avowed communists in Hollywood at the time. If you ever watched the movie Trumbo, it was an enjoyable movie, but they actually paint the communists pretty sympathetically.
Mm.
um, and who was the star of that? Bryan Cranston played Trumbo.
Hmm.
Definitely well produced movie, very enjoyable, but again, seems to have a pretty lefty agenda in it. Kind of proving McCarthy's point a little bit, maybe, as to
Maybe.
where Hollywood has ended up these days. But again, I'm not, don't want to overstate that. But anyways, so let's look at this article a little bit so you can get why they say this. And the reason I want to do this is because, like, not to make too much commentary on the McCarthy era, but to ask about the themes that they noticed in here that made them ask that question. Okay, because it is interesting. Did the FBI once deem It's a Wonderful Life communist propaganda? So the answer is mostly true from Snopes. Some say Snopes has a political agenda too, which is arguable. But we'll leave that aside because seems relatively innocuous and fact based here. They have some good citations. What's true? As part of a sweeping investigation of communist infiltration into the motion picture industry, FBI agents in the 1940s included "It's a Wonderful Life" in a list of motion pictures disclosing communist propaganda therein, claiming two of its writers were friendly with known communists, quote unquote, and saying the film used communist tricks, such as portraying the businessman, Mr. Potter, as a villain. However, what is false? The FBI did not, in a formal or official manner, declare or designate It's a Wonderful Life to be communist propaganda. So it wasn't official, but it was, investigated, considered. During the 2021 holiday season, internet users enthusiastically shared articles and posts that described a fascinating episode from the history of a classic American Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. On December 21st, for example, the London Independent reported that It's a Wonderful Life was once considered communist propaganda by the FBI, while various outlets shared their own accounts of the story. Those accounts were broadly accurate and based on high-quality primary documentary evidence. Although the FBI did not ever formally, as an institution, declare It's a Wonderful Life to be communist propaganda, FBI agents and informants investigated the movie and the people behind it as such. As part of a sweeping investigation ordered by Bureau Director J. Edgar Hoover, a special agent in 1949 included the film in a list of motion pictures disclosing communist propaganda therein. We are issuing a rating of mostly true. That description of the movie, which was released in December 1946, can be found in an archived and redacted copy of the FBI report on communist infiltration into the motion picture industry, available here. Specifically, it can be found on page 12 of the 9th of 15 dossiers released under the Freedom of Information Act at some point in the ensuing decades. Let's see. All right, but it's not specifically clear who wrote It's a Wonderful Life. Interesting. So, from what I read in here, basically, they show that at the very least, like, writers and producers of the movie were friends with some communists. There was some evidence of them communicating with each other. Question is, was that the intention in the themes of the movie? What I found, I don't know how quick we want to dive into it. I'm just trying to think. What I found is, have you ever heard of well, most people haven't heard of it. I think this is original with James Lindsay, the sort of current political commentator, anti-communist podcaster, you might say. He talks about the Mott and Bailey form of argumentation that you might have with someone. Now, I'm going to butcher this, but basically, it's sort of castle combat imagery historically. We have the Mott and you have the Bailey, and I can't remember which is which, but basically, you have your very defensible castle, your castle walls, and it's a very safe place to lob attacks from without being harmed. But you don't make as much progress on the battlefield that way. But then you go down into the field in a more dangerous position where you can advance, but you're in more danger. Okay, so this is an illustration imagery for a form of argumentation that certain political activists will use. James Lindsay talks about this a lot when he talks about Marxists and culture, where they have a very defensible position that they'll use in a more popular level. Like, for example, I care about people. I care about the poor. Don't you? Very defensible position that no one's going to disagree with, right? But then you turn your back. They come down to the more dangerous position. I can't remember. Like, again, one's the Mott, one's the Bailey, and I can't remember which means what. But basically, they come down to the, when you're not looking, they come down to the more dangerous position that has more radical goals. And then when you turn around and say, hey, you're actually saying this, like, no, we're just saying this, they go back behind the defensible position again. And so if this is true about It's a Wonderful Life, for instance, the themes are very agreeable to Christianity, I would say, in that you see a generous man who lives for his community, right? Something very defensible, very clearly Christian, like thinking of others above yourself, giving of your own resources. And it's very Christian, the dangers of wealth, the dangers of corruption among the rich, and how not to show favoritism toward the rich and how the rich should be generous. Those are all biblical themes. But the way that generally gets sort of hijacked by a Marxist per se is that in order to fight these quote unquote sins that Christians would call sins, or to promote these virtues, they'll try to enshrine them into law through like authoritarian redistribution systems. That's what they do while your back is turned, but then you turn around and say, what are you doing? No, we just love people, right? So that's the Mott and Bailey sort of principle, right?
Yep.
And so the question is that's what's happening here with It's a Wonderful Life? I don't know.
Right.
I don't know what you. How would you be able to prove that? Because there's nothing in the movie about political, about government economic systems. It's just a man showing this generosity.
Yeah.
But the thing is, communists will praise the idea of the socialist man, who basically abandons all individual ambition, and his entire makeup is for the social good, basically, right? And so it's if it's subversive, it's pretty darn clever, but if it's not subversive, it's a darn good set of Christian principles that are in the movie. And so how can we differentiate between the two when we're talking as Christians, do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting because there is the distinct possibility that those working on the film could have had influence, maybe leave it at that for now, influence of these things. And so they might put it in certain ways, like, painting the wealthy elite as the villain, just based on that alone. Power struggles there, the rich and the oppressed and all that stuff. And yet at the same time, they might stumble upon some common grace elements of good versus evil and those kind of things. So storytelling, I think, during this era hadn't got quite as driven by some of the more, I don't know, maybe I haven't watched enough movies to say that completely, but I don't feel like some of these earlier films were as driven by those agendas as they are today. Maybe they were influenced at times, but not so much driven. Whereas now I think sometimes it's just blatant. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I really can't say that for certain, but that's my feeling on it. I think the elements that do appear as far as being noble Christian themes, I think you can, especially with a film like that, you can embrace them, you can see them for what they are, and maybe be aware that you are starting to see some of the influences of these other worldviews into things like this. It is interesting. Like, I was just kind of was quickly looking it up, and you mentioned Trumbo.
Yeah.
Dalton Trumbo was the name. He actually did write a draft of this film. Yeah. Uh,
What?
yeah. So the ownership of the rights exchanged hands multiple times. And so at one point in time, he did work on a version that was ultimately scrapped. Um,
Okay.
he in that draft, ironically, George Bailey is an idealistic politician who
Oh,
grows more cynical as the story progresses. And after
that
losing an election, he tries to commit suicide.
uh
Yeah. So the world there was politics rather than
all this
business.
capitalism has got me so cynical. I just
Yeah.
oh.
So it makes you wonder though, like what could have been part of it may have influenced what ultimately came out.
Mhm.
Um, though it was scrapped. I guess I can't say for sure because I really don't know how much made it through um when Frank Capra got a hold of it.
Mhm.
Um,
Evidence is mounting that there may be some
yeah, there at the bare minimum, I would say there's some influence.
there's some influence. Yeah, but it's like it's in this weird era where it's like I don't know if it's the era or just the way the amount of hands in the kitchen or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like it landed in this sort of weird middle place where again there's no overt. I mean, there's sure some tropes in there that
Yeah.
could come from various motives about rich people or whatever, but um, in the end, all you have is an example of a selfless man,
Yeah.
right? That and like it does allow for a different lenses to see it different ways, and sort of the overt Christian spiritual elements of it sort of lend it to probably having Christians want to grab hold of it more, and I don't think they'd be wrong to do so, you know,
Hmm.
um, because there's no imperatives in there until you bring them yourself,
Yeah.
in regards to how to accomplish these virtues in a person, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does appear that Capra did a lot of work to the screenplay.
Hmm.
Apparently, so much that the people who are attributed as writers despised him. Like so.
What do we know about Capra?
I it doesn't sound like he was a wonderful guy. It sounds like one of those guys that just has to have his fingers on everything, micromanages every detail.
Yeah,
I I remember reading something about the guy a couple of years ago, and I guess because this movie is like so popular and all that, I guess I thought that he was more of an established filmmaker, and I think he I think he struggled for a while.
yeah. I guess from what I heard, this movie really was not successful initially. It became more of a
No,
classic over time. Yeah.
like it sunk the production company.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah, like there was a lot of drama with it,
Hmm.
beyond the film.
Yeah, it's kind of
Um,
like I mean, I've heard of a couple movies that way that were kind of like that. Well, I don't know if they were that bad, but like Shawshank Redemption, for instance, not successful in the box office, but then it became like the most rented movie like ever.
mhm,
But yeah, so some movies take time to really
yeah,
catch on.
yeah,
Um, yeah, in all honesty, it's like we're diving into the potential motives behind the movie, the potential issues from its original, you know, political writers or whatever. But even if all of it's true, it's like I can't help but almost cry at the end every time I watch it. It's like
yeah, yeah.
it does resonate. Call it common grace, call it whatever you want. It still resonates with me. Um, I can't get over that. But the funny thing about it now though is um it's like you go back to the 90s, if you were to bring up all this communist stuff, people would be like, "No, that's ridiculous. There's no way this movie has communist influence or whatever."
Yeah.
It may or may not, but the thing is now with a lot of the youths as it were coming out of college and whatever, like if you told them this movie might have like Marxist influence, they'd be like, "Oh, well, good." That
Right.
makes me like it more, you know,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate, but you know, state of things at the
And
moment.
ironically, it exists whether it was or wasn't. It exists in a world that is totally dependent upon capitalism. Um,
Hmm.
You know,
Sort of the
so
irony of Hollywood in general these days.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it was produced by Liberty uh, Pictures, Liberty Films.
Hmm.
Frank Capra was one of the founders of it. This movie bankrupted it.
Oh
They
my
lost
gosh.
so much money off of this film, even though the film actually did win some Academy Awards and whatnot.
Wow.
Um, I guess it goes to show you that not everything that wins an award is actually well received.
Right.
Um, it in its release, it bombed at the box office, and so by
Hmm.
1947 it was bankrupt or sell. They sold to Paramount, and by 1951 it was closed down. It was defunct.
Wow.
Paramount shut it down. Um,
Alrighty then.
yeah, so Frank Capra went on to do a couple other movies and whatnot. He had a career and all that, but this film company only made two movies as an independent film company. It's a Wonderful Life and State of the Union.
State of the Union. I guess I
That
don't
would
know
be
much
an
about that one.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be an interesting thing to check into. Like,
Yeah.
what was that movie like?
Yeah. So, all right. So, in summary, before we move on to some completely different, uh, mo- well, we're going to continue on with some political stuff, you might say, but very, very different. Um, any closing thoughts in regards to this relationship between this and Christianity, politics, the
Yeah.
whole hodgepodge? What do you think?
As far as this film directly and its influence with, or its tones and types and whatever that are part of Christianity,
Mhm.
um, sacrifices are indeed a part of life, and as believers, as Christians, we are
Yeah.
called to love one another. We're called to put others before ourselves, and the gospel of grace enables us to do that.
Let me ask.
Um,
Let me interrupt here.
yeah,
Well, you. I hate to interrupt when you're talking about the gospel of grace because this is not. That's not the question. That's not the question I was going to ask.
sure.
But, yeah, I guess I should have before summarizing. I guess I should have made this more of a main question. I guess it's it's a good sort of
Yeah,
final question. Maybe what is the relationship between Christianity and individual ambition or lack thereof?
hmm,
Because that is sort of a big enemy of socialism, basically.
yeah.
Um, like have you ever seen it's have you ever seen A Beautiful Mind?
I have. It's been a long time, but I
You
have.
you can kind of see Ron Howard's lefty opinions seep in a little
Mm,
bit. I mean, he was, I guess, being true to the economic opinions and influences of the actual person the movie's about. But
okay.
the beginning of the movie, he's arguing with his classmates about what's his name, Adam Smith, and they're basically saying individual ambition serves the common good. That was sort of the free market
Hmm.
argument, and then he wanted to moderate that basically. And and so that's sort of what's if this has if it has communist influence, you can see how that influences their view of George Bailey's ambitions. The whole beginning of the movie,
Sure.
he's like, I want to see the world, I want to build buildings, I want to, you know, do all these amazing things, and time after time after time he has to sacrifice it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
um and so there's a communist interpretation of that and there's a Christian interpretation of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, I would say, I guess for me personally, I don't know how well I can speak to the communist interpretation of that. I would say
Mhm.
for the person, like the Christian interpretation of that, I would say um, that it's coming from a place of love for the people that are a part of his life. He wants to do better for them. He uses the resources he has and his giftings as running the business and loan um, operation. Forget what it was called. The name of their family business was.
Mhm.
Um, he uses that and his ability to run that for the betterment of others. I think that all of that could be twisted under communism, but the way that I would say it is personal ambition doesn't necessarily go away. God gifts us all very uniquely. Each one of us has giftings and talents and are called into different spheres of life. Vocation, I think, is something that's not clearly taught these days. Vocation has some sense of calling involved in it. So I believe that God gifts people to do certain things, and not all of that means like ministry roles. Sometimes that means like people are really actually gifted for business and various things like that. And so I think part of the sacrifices that we see in this film that go along with that is, it's not all about building up the self. It's not all about my empire. He uses the resources and tools that he has for the betterment of his brother, the betterment of those in his community that he cares about. He's willing to sacrifice his hopes and dreams, but at the same time, it's not like the politicized view of that. Like he's not sacrificing everything of himself for the greater good of I guess the socialist agenda.
The
He's
state.
right. You don't see any of that really, in my
Mhm.
opinion, but you do see him caring for others, which is, I think, a gospel message. We are called to love one another and use the things that God has given us, the giftings He's given us, talents. You look at the parable of the talents. I was just looking at that the other day. Um, you know, the master in that parable, representing Christ, tells these um, servants to use the giftings that they've had to use his resources wisely.
Mhm.
And you can tell, like, in the end of it, the ones that knew the master, the ones that had faith in who he was, knew he was going to return, used those resources wisely, while
Mhm.
the one at the end, who buried it in a grave or whatever, buried it in a field or something and forgot about the master, um, he honestly didn't believe in him. He didn't have faith that the master was going to return. So kind of his thought is, well, at the end of the day, I still got this coin. Even if he never comes back, I've got it. It's just buried somewhere. I'll go back and get it.
Mhm.
And he doesn't know him. You see it. He's like, you're a harsh master. He didn't know him.
Mhm.
He didn't believe him. He didn't really truly know him. Otherwise, he would have gone and done the very thing he was asked to do. So all that to say, um, God equips us for lots of different things. People have different giftings, talents. I don't think there's anything wrong with using business acumen. There's a big word for me.
Mm.
Business acumen to be successful. To build a life, as long as there's a sense of generosity, born out of grace and gratitude,
Mhm.
that comes along with that.
Yep. All right. I think that's a pretty good summary. Pretty good analysis. I don't have too much to add to that, really. Um,
I feel like I rambled, but I have a
no,
tendency.
no. Yeah, I think God does make people to differ in their wealth, I think, and that's
Hmm.
okay. Um, it depends on what you do with it, really.
Yeah.
And is your motive going to be love in the midst of all of it? Is your motive going to be centered around the gospel? And um, I'd say, yeah, you did point out, I think, a distinction there between, um, sort of the state centered socialist,
Yeah.
uh, sort of thing versus being centered around your actual community. I think there
Yeah.
is a distinction there, and you can see it in the movie to an extent where um, George Bailey does focus, like, I mean, scripturally, it says that the one who doesn't provide for the needs of his household or for the household of what the needs of his household is worse than an unbeliever. But then it talks about caring for the household of faith.
Yeah.
But then ultimately everyone, but there is an order of priority. And
Yeah.
that's basically what you see in the movie. He's not a statist in his actions. um,
Right.
he,
Which I would say is the delusional part. Maybe delusional is the wrong word. The hypocrisy, the lie that comes with communism, and my understanding of it is, sure, it's cloaked in taking care of others, like you said a little bit earlier,
Mhm.
this love for brothers, our comrades, as they probably would say,
Uh-huh.
in arms. But the reality is, who actually is benefiting from it? it
Hmm.
it actually still is the elite that are
Yeah.
benefiting from it.